Hi, I'm Debby Brown. I'm so excited about Stonehenge's 10th anniversary block party celebration. I have here the Night Over Stonehenge block from the Quilt Basket in Wappingers Falls, New York, and I'd love to show you how to quilt it. To help me plan the quilting for this Night Over Stonehenge block, I'm using some Quilter's preview paper. It's a roll of cellophane that I lay right over top of the block, and I can draw on the cellophane to see what the quilting will look like without touching the quilt. So don't get nervous when you see me take a permanent marker to it. Looking at this quilt, the place that the quilting will show is in the light areas. The darker areas, the quilting's really not going to show unless I use a very heavily contrasting thread. So I don't want to say it's not important what I stitch in there, I'm just saying it's not the focal point. And I want the focal point of this block to be some feathers. So I'm looking at this pinwheely type area here. And I'm going to use this line right here, the edge of the diamond, as the spine for my feather. And fill it in there. And then while my needle's here, I can get to these two light color triangles. So what I'm going to do in there is put some swirls just to fill it up. So there's a swirl, bring my thread here, I'm going to come over here, and then I'm going to break my thread, start again in the middle. Now when I make the feathers, I go up a ski slope, around half of a circle, and come back down. That's how I make a feather. And I'll come over here. Start again here. If feathers are not comfortable for you, you might want to make some swirls. They'll fill the area the same way, and you don't have to retrace them as perfectly as you think. You don't have to retrace them well at all. I like seeing the extra row of thread. And that goes well with the swirls and the rest of the quilt. So I'll put some more swirls here, and you can decide which ones you like the best. Now for the rest of the quilt, I'm going to do the same thing out here with more feathers, but I don't have to draw that in. With the rest of the quilt, I'm going to stitch ribbon candy because it happens to be my favorite quilting design. And I'm going to start right here. I hope you can see it with the red marker. So it's around a half of a circle diagonally backwards, around a half a circle diagonally backwards, and I work my way up and down the shape. And that's going to hold this area down so that the feathers seem to pop a little more. If ribbon candy is a little bit of a stretch for you, you can stitch up and curve and down and curve, and it'll have a similar effect. And I'm going to do that all the way around. I'm going to do the same ribbon candy out in the green area here and out to the edge. And in these last triangles, I will stitch a swirl. So that is my quilting plan. And if I forget what it is, I can take my cellophane somewhere I can see it, and it'll remind me of my quilting pattern. Now to choose thread color for this, this isn't a solid cream, so I'm going to put a little darker thread on it than you'd think I might, because I want to be able to see the feather. And this is a Master Quilter polyester thread from Wonderfill, and it's a camely brown color. So it's going to show up on the cream a little more than you think it will, but I really want to see the definition of the feathers. And then I'm going to use the same thread through the whole block because it's going to blend in well with the oranges, the golds, and also in the blues and greens there's also a bit of an orange undertone there that the same thread will pick up that color throughout the whole quilt. So let's take this to the machine and see how the quilting goes. I've threaded my machine with the camel color Master Quilter thread. I've added my open toe free motion quilting foot to my machine, and I've dropped my feed dogs. I'm going to start in the center with needle down, needle up to pull up the bobbin thread. I just don't want any surprises on the back of my quilt. So I'm going to hold the two threads together and take a couple small stitches. And now I'm going to start working on the feathers. So I'm stitching up around the curve and back down to the line. Up, around the curve, back to the line. And now I'm going to follow the stitching up. I'm in the corner and I'm going to stitch my first swirl. I'm going to trace that swirl back, but I'm not worried about whether it's perfect or not. And what I did was I traced the swirl and swooped over to get my needle where I need it to be for the next swirl. So I've stitched in the ditch over to the next corner. Make a swirl here. Back up to the top. Come back down. And now I'm going to start with my ribbon candy, and I'm going to make the ribbon candy parallel to this long line. The thread blends really well. No matter what I used, it was going to be hard to see the quilting in this darker block. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch over to here, to that corner, and I'm going to do my ribbon candy parallel to these long lines. As promised, you can hardly see that stitching on the darker color. I'm going to repeat those feathers in the next light area of fabric. While I've stopped, let me get rid of that thread. And another swirl. And I'm going to stitch in the ditch down to the corner. And I'm going to ribbon candy back through the darker areas as I showed before. Parallel to that long line. stitch in the ditch, and then I'll be parallel to these long lines.
Now I'm back in the center. I'm going to take a couple small stitches to make my knot. I'm going to pull away, stitch back down in the same hole to bring up my bobbin thread. So now I have all of my threads in one place and can cut the knot. I'm going to start my second round of quilting. I'm going to do the ribbon candy out here, so I'll start needle down, needle up, pull up that bobbin thread, a couple small stitches to start, and away I go. So parallel to that long line, And now I'm going to do parallel to the next long line. Just turn that ribbon candy diagonally. I'm going to stitch parallel to the long line, which has me going backwards. Stitch straight across the top here. Down diagonally here, stitching parallel to the long line. Cut these threads while I'm here. Stitch my last diagonal and I'm done with this round. Now that I'm at the end, I'm going to stitch and stitch over so I can begin this one to stitch the feathers in this long area. I'm going to stitch all my feathers going around clockwise. Now I'm going to stitch up to the next one and start again. When I first learned how to quilt feathers, I could only quilt them in one direction. I can now quilt them in all directions, but if you're struggling with direction, on a piece this size, it's very easy to turn your quilt and attack them head on. If you're working on this block as part of a larger quilt, it may be more difficult to turn it. turn for the last time around. So I finished that round of feathers. The next thing I'm going to do is stitch in the ditch down till I get to the edge of the quilt. I want to stitch down the edges so that while I'm quilting the next areas, I don't pucker the edge of the quilt. As long as I stitch somewhere within the last 1/4 inch, I know that that will be within my binding. And again, if you have this stitched as part of a larger quilt, you won't have to worry about your 1/4 inch or stitching down the edges at this point. Now I'm going to stitch the ribbon candy coming along these long lines, perpendicular to those long lines. Overstitch ribbon candy here, perpendicular to the long line again. And I've changed my mind from the drawing. I want to stitch down here and stitch feathers along that long line again. I think in my drawing I said I was going to do a swirl, but I've decided against it. Stitch back here. Pick up the ribbon candy. And then my last ribbon candy in this outer teal color. and I'll treat all 4 corners the same way. When I'm stitching here, because I'm at the edge of the fabric, I'm being careful not to hit my stitching in the last 1/4 inch of the block, because that's where the binding will be applied. And here I can start that corner all over again. And here's the completed block.
Thanks for joining me to help celebrate Stonehenge's 10th anniversary. I hope you get some ideas about how to quilt your block party celebration quilt. Be sure to check out the links below for more quilty goodness. Happy quilting!